Hello, everybody. Welcome to the live stream. I'm Father Roderick. It is time to talk about Star Wars. And today I want to share with you my first reaction, spoiler-free, to the 11th and penultimate episode of Star Wars Andor. Next week, it's going to be the finale of the first season. And it is looking really, really good. I'll expand on that in a second. And then when I'm done giving you my initial impression, we will look at some of your questions. Last week, I've been gathering some of your feedback and questions about Andor and about Star Wars in general, and I would like to respond to those questions. So, welcome to the live stream. If you are new here, please introduce yourself to the community, and if you are a returning visitor, then welcome back. It's always fun to talk about Star Wars. So, I have just finished watching episode 11 of Andor. It literally a few minutes ago, I was watching the credits, and I want to share with you my initial impression, but it's not easy because I have to stay spoiler-free, because many of you haven't had time yet to watch the episode. But there is so much in this episode, and there are so many feelings. Let me tell you about my first, like how do you say that? The most predominant feeling that I have right now is sadness. And not because it was a bad episode. On the contrary, I think, again, this was a genius episode. It's so difficult to rank the episodes because every episode is different, has its own quality, its own merit, and also its own style. This episode is at once, at the same time, very fast-paced in the sense that we go through all the characters, we catch up. How is that person doing? What's going on there? Remember what happened a few episodes ago? Well, here is what's next. So every element and every character that we've seen so far gets a moment in this episode. So you would think that this would go like at a super fast pace, because a lot of the previous episodes kind of dwelled on one character or one or two situations. And that helped the series to let us be in this universe, to empathize with the characters, even with the bad guys. We start to understand their plight, what their reasoning is, where they're coming from, what they're going through. There's a lot of room with these 12 episodes in this first season for character building, and also for an emotional connection with each and every character. And you need room for that. You need time for that to happen. So what about this episode when we have so many different plates in the air? So many balls to juggle, so many things happening, so many people that we have invested in for a couple of months now, and we care for each and every one of them. We want to know where they're going. So how can they do justice to all these different character arcs without breaking the overall style of Andor, which is kind of like a slow burn? I don't know how they did it, but they pulled it off. Every moment, every situation that we get to see in this episode has room to breathe. And I think it is because of what the writers have called negative space. This is something that they revealed in an interview very recently when they were talking about this first season and what they're planning for the next season. And they said the more they evolved in writing the episodes, the more they understood that sometimes you can strengthen what is happening by leaving it out. and you fill in the gaps. And that is exactly what happened in this episode. So we catch up. There are a few missing pieces at first. And if this had been like classic linear storytelling that we're so used to, if this was just another space adventure, a space opera, then we would have seen like, I cannot go into spoilers, but you would follow these main characters, and there would be a balance between action scenes and then a bit of dialogue, a bit of exposition, and then we go to the next part of the story. Here, they just leave out complete action sequences. Like, so, wait, so now they're here. So, okay. They show us sometimes in just a few images, like 1 minute, they catch you up. It's like, okay, so this is their predicament, and let's move on. And by creating this negative space, you yourself, and this is why it's such quality storytelling, you fill in the blanks. You don't need to see it all, because it's much more important what happens next. And what they do show us all has to do with the pivotal moments in character development. They are setting up all the chess pieces for the grand finale. Not in terms of action per se, or even like building up tension, but in terms of storytelling. It looks to me as if you imagine the character development and world building in Andor Season 1 like a steady, upgoing slope. We are now at the kind of the pivotal moment, literally. Some of these characters will fall down and will go down. Other characters may be at the point where it's gonna jump up in hyperspace. But all these character developments are now at a point where it needs resolution. And that is something that I was most impressed with in this episode, is how you realize at the end, when the credits roll, you realize what they've been doing for 11 episodes. And how every character is right now ready for the finale. Not for some kind of big action spectacle. I'm sure that there will be action, but much more like character action. This is going to be the emotional discharge of everything they've been building up. And you want to know how all these characters are going to cope with that ultimate confrontation with each other, with the story, with the how do you say that without saying anything specific? I hope I'm not too theoretical, not too vague, but I am much more eager to find out what happens to them emotionally than what happens to them, let's say, physically. What's going to be their next stop? Which planet are they going to end up? How are they going to resolve the quest of the Empire that has certain goals, and then you've got the rebels, they have certain goals. You've got Mon Mothma and her political scene and her personal family situation. All that is working towards, lots of things are going to happen in the finale, but I care less about what's going to happen than what the events will do to these characters that I am so connected with right now. And that was pretty stunning what they did. Now, in addition to that, what I also really appreciated about this episode is that they do a couple of classic Star Wars things that we haven't seen that much so far. So there are mainly two elements. And I'm going to be extremely vague here, but just to give you an idea, if you see the episode, you will know what I'm talking about. If you have already seen it, you know what I'm referring to. There are two elements that were sorely lacking for some. And some people, most people love Andor and think it's one of the best things that happened to Star Wars since since A New Hope. But there were two elements that avid Star Wars fans were missing. Not because the rest of the story isn't good, but it's just because it's so classic, a part of the mix-up in Star Wars. One is aliens. We haven't seen any alien, or hardly any aliens. Like the whole prison arc, 4 episodes, I think, from the moment that Cassian gets convicted to the moment that he escapes. There were no aliens in that whole facility. And in previous episodes, we've seen some glimpses here and there, just very, very briefly. Well, there is one sequence in this episode where I think they make up for that. And you're just like, oh, yeah. Oh, man, that is great. That is great. We got some really cool alien action. And we get introduced to a couple of aliens, and I think it's pretty good. It feels very, very Star Wars, and it's like, okay, yeah, this is the right moment to introduce that, and it doesn't really interfere that much. It's not a style. How do you say that? Since we haven't seen that many aliens, you kind of don't want the aliens in this episode to be a big deal, but it's still there, and it's executed very well. That's the first one. The other element that a lot of people were missing was space. Where it's Star Wars. We've seen the wars. Why don't we look up to the stars every once in a while and get some space action? Well, this episode has it, and it has it in a brilliant way. There is this one sequence in this episode that blew me away. It was awesome. And it wasn't just space action. It also showed us a side of one of the main characters that we hadn't seen yet. Like, there is this one character who has more up his sleeve than has been revealed so far, and you're like, oh wow, okay, I didn't know that about that person. But cool. All right, so those were highlights. I said my first emotion that I felt when the credits rolled was that of sadness, and that has to do with what happens to all these characters. The writers, Tony Gilroy and the others, when they were interviewed recently, they said one of the major themes in Andor, especially in this first season, was the theme of sacrifice. And it's that leading theme that has guided them in the development of all these different character arcs. They wanted us to feel that this story requires huge sacrifices from almost everyone that we meet. And we've already seen people making a lot of sacrifices. We've seen a lot of suffering, and a lot of that is way more raw and vicious and feels way more real than anything we've seen up until this moment in the Star Wars canon. But ultimately, of course, sacrifice goes way beyond physical suffering or even psychological suffering. We've seen torture scenes. We've seen people getting killed. But what is the next level in terms of sacrifice? It is when you lose people you love. If you have to let go of a life you wanted to live, a future that you were aiming for. It's those kind of sacrifices that all have to do with letting go and mourning that loss. And then the big question mark, of course, is, so what's next? Is there still something to live for? When you lose your future prospects, the people you love, your idea of the future, how can you go on? That is a major question for a number of characters in this episode. And we see already in this episode how that sacrifice, or the doom of the approaching sacrifice that will be required of them, how much that makes them suffer, and how much we suffer with them. And we feel that pain and that sadness of letting go, because we can empathize with sacrifices like that, because we ourselves in our real lives, we have made similar sacrifices. And it's because of this, I would say, the breadth, the diverse characters. There is someone for everyone that you can relate to. Some people will identify with Mon Mothma because they themselves are parents and have children and also have a job and responsibilities outside of the family, and that clashes. So you can empathize with her situation. Other people have lost their siblings, their family. Some people have gone through types of torture, abuse, personal crises. Some people have gone through moments of violence that was inflicted upon them, and then have to deal with, so how do I pick myself up again? How can I move on when I'm so damaged now? A lost love. How can we continue when the person or the persons that we live for, that we wanted to live with, are separated from us in one way or another? All these different elements, they're all embodying in different ways this major theme of sacrifice. And that is why at the end of this episode, I felt like I was about to reveal something about a major character, or no, not a major, a minor character in the show, but I'm not going to say it. But there, at the beginning of the episode, there is this very, very sad character, let's put it that way, and it starts with that particular sadness, which is very relatable, and then at the end of the episode, you feel exactly like that character. It's brilliant. It is so incredibly well constructed and crafted. And it's done also with a lot of restraint. That's another thing that I really appreciated about this episode. It's not in your face. It doesn't tell you how to feel. But it's the writing is so good that you feel it, because they just show you what these people go through. And so I thought maybe the writing in this episode was above anything that they've done with Andor so far. I thought it was just a 10 out of 10. There's no other way to put it. Which gives me high hopes for the finale. I think this will be unlike any other Star Wars finale that we've seen so far. And I'm also pretty confident that they will end on a cliffhanger. And I don't think we're going to like it. I'm not going to say anything else. I'll leave that for my spoiler review. But yes, I think they're going to pay off all these. Well, we're going to see what happens now that everybody is jumping off the cliff. So that's going to be gratifying. But you just know that stuff is going to happen that will make you super, super sad. And also, like, you really want to see the rest of the story. But we'll have to wait more than a year before that is ready. They're going to start filming season 2 in a couple of days from now. And of course, season 2 will be very different from season 1 in that we will get these time jumps. They're going to be these gaps, negative space of 4 years, I think, between every 3 episodes. So there's going to be 3 episodes We see a bit of the story. Then we jump forward a couple of years. Then we see where are these characters now, and not everyone will be where they were in the previous episode. So that's story-wise, it's very interesting. And then ultimately, of course, it will all lead up to the point where Rogue One begins. And so, yeah, I cannot wait to see what they do in the next season. It's going to be very different. At the same time, a lot of the writers for this season are going to be involved as well. So I have no doubt that the excellent dialogue and acting, direction, editing, there is just so much to love in this series. I'm sure we'll all be back for season 2. There's one final thing that I want to share with you, spoiler free also, but I want to bring that to your attention. And it is the very last shot of this episode. It's not random. The place, the lighting, what you see, who is there, it's not random. It is meant to rhyme with something that is still to come. When you see it, you'll know it. That's all I'm going to say. I'd love to hear your first reactions to this episode. Leave your comments beneath this video. And of course, be careful with the spoilers. You can, do like a countdown or something like that. But be careful, especially like in the first day after this video is posted, because not everyone will have seen it, and you don't want people to just browse through the comments and then all of a sudden hear what's happening to the characters. So. And then, of course, stick around if you want to hear my answers to some of your questions. But before I go to the Q&A section of this Star Wars Hour, I just want to welcome a few of you in the chat. We've got Peter is there, Andre, Sandy, Liz, Dino, Jacopo from Italy. Hi, Italy. Buonasera. Margot is there, Michiel is there. It's always great to have that live audience. And when I'm done with the Q&A, I will get back to you and maybe already gather some content or some questions or remarks for the next Star Wars Hour. This would be a good moment, if you like what you see, to give this video a thumbs up. And if you haven't done so already, to subscribe to the channel for more. All right, let's go to the questions. Peter wants to know, how can you convince this Star Trek fan to start watching Star Wars? Now, this is a hard question, of course, because it's clearly someone who loves science fiction. Otherwise, you wouldn't be a Star Trek fan. But you're also used to a certain type of storytelling. Whereas Star Wars, at first glance, may seem similar because it's about stars, it has spaceships, it's got a lot of elements, aliens, captains, drama, wars, negotiations, betrayal, friendship. A lot of the elements in Star Wars are similar to Star Trek, and yet these two genres, these two franchises couldn't be more different. And I think it has to do with a couple of things. First of all, Star Wars is not specifically sci-fi. There are science fiction elements in Star Wars, but if you look at what the writers and creators, George Lucas in the first place, of course, but then all the other writers that have continued to build upon his stories, what they're doing is actually more akin to fantasy, more than science fiction. So science fiction, the word itself kind of already gives us the definition of what it wants to be. It is fictional science. It's like it is preoccupied with scientific progress, but in a fictional universe. And it could be a fictional future, could be a fictional past. But it's focusing more on technological advancement. Star Wars is often called space opera or a space fairy tale. And in Star Wars, it's much more about creating a fantastic universe. Fantastic not in the sense that it's brilliant, it is, but more it's using your imagination, your fantasy to create a world that is like a mirror verse, you could say, of the world that you live in. And It is in this fairy tale world that you go on adventures and you learn. But it's much less focused on classic science fiction elements. This is like the spaceships are there, but they are there to serve the story. They're just a tool. You don't spend an entire season on the bridge of a starship, like, for instance, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, where everything you see is taking place in the confines of this space station, this outpost in space. Star Wars is always about moving. It's about the journey. And so if you like those kind of stories where you will meet a few characters and they're usually novices. They're green as grass. They have so much to learn. And somehow, because the galaxy is in upheaval, they are invited to go on an adventure. You see the similarities maybe with The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. And you start to discover that galaxy, that fantastical world, through their eyes. And slowly this world starts to come into place, and you get to know more planets, and this is an ever-expanding universe. Now, you could say with Star Trek that's the same thing, because they fly around, and they even go to the Delta Quadrant, and they will encounter new planets. But the main difference is, in Star Wars, it all builds upon each other. All these different places that we go to, the different peoples and alien species that we meet, they all start to become part of this overall fabric. And once they are part of that world, they are revisited multiple times. Whereas in Star Trek, and I'm speaking in general because of course it's not as black and white as I'm trying to put it now, just to differentiate these two genres. But in Star Trek, it's much more linear. They go to one planet, and then they solve a problem, and then they go to the next planet. That other planet, the stories, what happens there, has nothing to do with what happened on the previous planet. What does happen is that while following these crews of the various enterprises and spaceships through space, you will see that this crew will become a family and will start to rely upon each other. They learn from one another. And so, but it's focused on the evolution of the characters. That in Star Trek is super important. In Star Wars, it is about characters, and of course you need to have a personal kind of emotional connection with the characters for the story to work. But it's much more about this entire world that becomes part of your imagination. And so it's not just about this one character or this one villain or no, it's about how all these characters kind of somehow relate to one another, but it's about the world in which they live and the things that are at stake in that world. So how can I convince a Star Trek fan to check out Star Wars? I would say, if you love good storytelling, if you like adventures, if you like to be in a world that is not yet, that's one of the reasons that I love Star Trek, is it's my date with adventure. I love to kind of forget about everything that's happening in the world that I live in, to kind of go on this journey into the unknown. And you never know what you're going to get, but there's always at one point there is a good resolution. You feel great. You start to love all these crew members. You get to know them. They become almost part of your kind of virtual imaginary family. That, if you like that kind of storytelling and that particular aspect of Star Trek, then yes, you will probably also like Star Wars, because that is similar. You go on this adventure in a new world, but it's if you're watching Star Trek mostly for to imagine a future that maybe one day will be ours. Like science fiction oftentimes has a bit of a prophetic element to it. Think of the pads that they use in Star Trek in the past. In Voyager, there were still like pieces of plastic with a decal on it. And now in more recent episodes, these are iPads or Android driven tablets that they kind of predicted these mobile devices that we have. So oftentimes science fiction will kind of point ahead. This may be where we're heading, and we hope, because it's especially with Star Trek, it's a very optimistic future. Despite, of course, all the resistance, because without drama you don't have a story. In Star Wars, I would say it's more like a fairy tale. It's not really a possible future that you can dream about. In the case of Star Wars, it's talking about the past, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. But it's more a story that, in many ways, initiates us into the values of life, into what is important, the choices that our main adventure characters are facing. And you learn by following their plight and by identifying with all these characters. In many ways, what I think Star Wars can be a bit difficult to get into, because when you start watching Star Wars, it feels a bit superficial. It's just space opera. The dialogue is not particularly good in the first movies. Of course, special effects, it's all great, but special effects are, that they should serve the story. And maybe some of the characters may be... Star Wars is usually super fast-paced, especially in the George Lucas era. So you don't get to spend a lot of time with these characters, so you relate to them. If you think of A New Hope, the first movie, there's this character called Obi-Wan Kenobi, and it's this nice guy, but he's killed even before you get to know him properly. So there's not much of an emotional connection. What I like about the Star Wars storytelling universe is that they often go back in time, or they develop other genres like comic books or novels, television series, and they will fill in the emotional gaps in the movie. And so retrospectively, when you are a little bit more advanced in the Star Wars world, you go back to that original movie, and then you will feel much more because you have gotten to know these characters in a different series or in a book or whatever. So there is a lot of what I like about Star Wars is you can come back to these stories over and over again, and that universe building, the galaxy building, the more it becomes more intricate and interrelated, the more you will start to understand your first steps in that story. There's a lot of layering that happens over time in the Star Wars universe, whereas in Star Trek, that happens mostly with the characters, and even in some of the series of Star Trek, even that doesn't really happen. Especially if you look at classic Star Trek, these episodes were not really that related. The Captain Kirk from episode 1 is still more or less the same Captain Kirk that you see in episode 4 or 5. Because there's this constant reset in between the episodes. In Star Wars, that is not the case. Every new part of the story will give extra layers to the first part, and so there's this more circular motion, whereas in Star Trek, I feel it's more linear. If this makes you curious, at least, I would invite you to just give it a try. Watch the first 3 Star Wars movies that were made: A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. That did it for most of us Star Wars fans. So it's an investment of a couple of hours. It's not much. And you will get to see a much better version of those movies than we've seen when they were first in movie theaters, because these movies have been polished over time and improved quite a bit. So I would say try out these first 3 movies. If you're hooked, then the rest of the Star Wars narrative is going to be just more of that and better. and if after these 3 movies you're like, yeah, I don't care, this is stupid, it won't work, then I would say let it rest. Star Wars is not for everyone, just as Star Trek is not for everyone. If you like similar genres, if you like fantasy, if you like Tolkien, then I think you will feel at ease in the Star Wars universe, because the type of storytelling is very similar. And for Star Wars fans who want to check out Star Trek and they've never seen one single episode, I would say, oh, yeah, you'll like it. You'll like it. And there's a lot of Star Trek. I would discourage you to start with the original series. I would say definitely check out The Next Generation. For me personally, if you want to get like an up-to-date modern Star Trek story that still harkens back to everything that classic Star Trek was so good at, watch Strange New Worlds. Strange New Worlds for me is the best modern Star Trek because it's so old-fashioned, if you see what I mean. Let's go to the next question. Kirk, and that's his real name, wants to know, how has Andor enriched or changed your view of the original trilogy? That's a very good question. And there's not one single answer to this. Andor has... Andor is very much a contrast to the original trilogy. It does a lot of things in the total opposite way of A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. One thing, for instance, is its pacing. The original trilogy is super fast-paced. We don't spend much time with these characters. Of course, Luke Skywalker, Leia, Han Solo, Chewie, R2-D2, C-3PO. You get to know those characters quite well over the course of those 3 movies. But there are a lot of other characters that we barely get to know. Darth Vader. He's just this creepy guy, and it's only towards the very, very last moment that we get to understand a little bit more where he comes from, but all his backstory, what is going on behind the mask, all that is explained much, much later, and it takes years, decades even, to develop his character. Andor, on the contrary, gives us a lot of time to get to know a very, very small group of people. We spend a lot of quality time with them, not just in the moments where they shine and can be the hero, but also in moments of despair, moments of loss, moments of tragedy, of mourning, moments of boredom even, where not much happens. Think of Cyril Karn, this very low-level security guard, but we spend so much time with him, and we see what day-to-day life on the Empire side looks like. We get to know these rebels that are just barely rebels. It's just this kind of ragtag group of people, and not all of them have the same idealistic outlook as we were used to from Luke Skywalker and Leia Organa. We see a lot of people that don't really have any idea what their role is in the story and how they can even change anything about the universe. There's a lot of powerlessness in Andor. So it teaches me that the original trilogy, what the original trilogy did super well is planting seeds and use all the other storytelling later, the Clone Wars, the prequels, the sequels, the novels, the expanded universe, even the video games, to let those seeds come to full fruition. And Andor shows me that small elements in the original trilogy are so powerful and have so much hidden storytelling potential that you can just you can slow down and you can dwell in that universe and it holds up. The Coruscant, a number of the other planets, they're similar to locations that we've seen in the original trilogy. But in the original trilogy, we just saw glimpses. But the genius was already there, just to come up with this planet that is covered in basically one big city, Coruscant. And then now in Andor, to see that, yeah, you can spend days, if not weeks, in that environment, and it works. That planet is not a gimmick. It's just such a genius idea. The main themes of the original trilogy as well. The original stories of Star Wars were also about sacrifice, about idealism, but also about accomplishment and victory that is never possible and attainable without paying a price. There's a lot of that in the original trilogy. Well, that's Andor for you. It's every rebellion requires suffering for people to experience that something needs to change. And it takes the loss and the tragedy and the lack of prospect. It takes it so seriously. It's all there in a very, very how would you say that? In a nuclear form in the original trilogy. And here in Andor, you see that even a few of those elements are enough to fill an entire season of 12 episodes. That is how I see the way in which these two totally different stories still relate to one another. And it's both Star Wars, very much. Will we ever get to see a television series about Dooku or Qui-Gon Jinn? I don't know who asked this question, but I wrote it down. Of course, I don't work for Lucasfilm, so I don't know. Maybe we will. But I'll tell you what I think about those ideas. I think it's not very likely, because Qui-Gon Jinn is we've seen a lot of his character, like the essence of what he brings to the table. We've seen that in the prequels. We get a few more glimpses of his relationship with Count Dooku, because Qui-Gon Jinn was an apprentice of Dooku. So that's fun. We've seen that in Tales of the Jedi, and I felt it was well executed. But at a certain point, I was like, yeah, I'm fine with that. I don't need to know more about Qui-Gon Jinn. It was nice to see him also, of course, briefly in Obi-Wan Kenobi, the television series. But I feel like if you would show more of Qui-Gon Jinn, maybe it would dilute his character. So yeah, I don't think his character nor that of Dooku would add much to what we already know. So yeah, I don't think it's likely that they will do a separate television series about these characters. Not to mention, of course, that, you know, Liam Neeson is probably not in for an entire season, and probably would be cost prohibitive to hire him. He will probably, his character and Dooku's character will probably show up every once in a while in, you know, some flashbacks or stuff. But yeah, no, I don't think we're going to get series about them. Paul Miller wants to know, I am a loving grown-up Star Wars fan, but I came to it as a child. Do you think that the mix of kids and adult content is handled well? Yes. Yes, that's one of the things that I appreciate so much about Star Wars and about the franchise. It is that they are telling stories for different age groups in a consistent universe. We've seen some of those shorts. Like just the other day, Studio Ghibli did a short animated short about Grogu, Baby Yoda, and the dust mittens, and it's charming. It's definitely for children. We've seen some of the animated series that were geared towards very young kids. The Lego Star Wars games, very family friendly. Like a 6-year-old can play these games and have a lot of fun. And then we've got Andor on the total opposite of the spectrum, and it's not for kids, and I don't think that kids would even watch it, even if they wanted to. I mean, it's just probably going to bore them to death, because it is written in such a way that you have to reach a certain maturity yourself to appreciate what they're doing. And then you've got the middle ground, and that's the stories that I think hold up for everyone. Now, what I think is a quality of Star Wars is that even the children's series, the animated series that are geared towards a younger generation, and I think I can even include Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels to a certain extent, although those stories, of course, got some mature themes and story development later on. But when it started, there were some goofy episodes, clearly for kids. However, for adults, it still works. You still want to watch it. It's still good. I play the Star Wars Lego games. And that's something that C.S. Lewis once said about fairy tales and about children's stories. He said a good children's story can also be appreciated by adults. Bad children's stories are just catering to the kids. And there's not much there. And even kids will probably don't like the story. The more layers are in there for different age groups, the more that story will have a chance to become a classic story. And I think Star Wars does that very, very well. Very well. The other way around, of course, not so much. I mean, children will not appreciate... So a kid who is playing Lego Star Wars will not play like a hardcore first-person shooter Star Wars game. They will first need to grow up a little bit more. Yeah, I think Star Wars is handling that balance very well, and I would hope that after the success of Andor, because this is a new experience for Lucasfilm and for Disney, now that they've seen the critical success of Star Wars Andor, I'm not sure about the numbers. Maybe this is not as, bringing in the huge numbers as, for instance, I don't know, the Clone Wars did, or the Mandalorian. But I think for the future of the franchise, we need also to tell more adult stories, and I can see some other genres that Star Wars could be very good at. I mean, you could do horror, Star Wars horror, absolutely. The Mines of Kessel. You could do detective stories. You could do medical dramas. Why not? It's almost every genre. And then, of course, like more hardcore war drama, like we've seen in Rogue One. I think if there's one thing that Andor shows us is that the universe, the galaxy that was built by George Lucas and all the other writers is strong enough for any genre to flourish in. Provided, of course, a political drama. We get a little bit of that with Mon Mothma and Andor, and we did get quite a bit of politics, of course, in the prequels and in the Clone Wars, but something on the level of, let's say, the West Wing, or I think you could do that, but maybe not soon. Maybe in the 10 years from now. There is just so much storytelling potential. Any thoughts, asks Kirk, on how the showrunners are making the Empire so freaking real and so evil? Yes, I know how they do that. Because the costumes are the same. We've seen their weapons of mass destruction, the threat of their destroyers and all that, the TIE fighters, and even the occasional Sith Lord. But how do they make the Empire in Andor feel so scary? It is because more than ever before, they use history as their inspiration. They use the dawn of fascism in Nazi Germany, even before the Second World War. And a lot of the dialogue, the themes, the methods that they use, the way of thinking, their worldview is modeled on what the Nazis did. Their flawed ethics, the dehumanization of people around the time of the Second World War, of course, what happened to the Jews, the persecution of minorities, the racism, the intolerance, the abuse of power, the corruption, all that in Andor is rooted very, very firmly in a good knowledge of what happened in fascism, and not just around the Second World War. We've seen several moments in history where mankind just loses its way, and in this fictional universe of Star Wars, Andor shows us that those mechanisms are the same everywhere, even in a fictional universe, and we can relate to what we see, and we are so frightened because we recognize this, and it is like, yes, the Empire is not just a caricature, like it sometimes has been in Star Wars, but in Andor, you see, the Empire is just like the real world. It's scary how realistic it is, because it is just a fictional version of what we've seen happening and is still happening today. Look at what's going on in Ukraine now and what Russia is doing. These types of villains have existed and do exist and will exist. This is why Andor is so frightening. It's far too real. The gaming politician wants to know, what is your opinion on Colin Trevorrow's leaked episode 9 script, Jewel of the Fates? This is something that was leaked and also confirmed by Colin Trevorrow himself after the sequel trilogy was finished. Colin Trevorrow had to bow out of directing the final episode or the final sequel movie because of his obligations with the Jurassic Park series. But he did write a script, and the script itself was published. It wasn't a finished script, of course, because that would have gone through so many rewrites, and I've read it, and I liked it as a standalone Star Wars story. It had all the classic elements, so in that respect, yeah, a lot of action, lots of classic stuff. But I did not like it at all as a conclusion of the sequel trilogy. I thought it was more of the same. It felt superficial. It was a lot of fan service. So what I liked about it is also what I disliked about it, because I think that the sequel trilogy deserved better. I'm not saying that what we ultimately got was perfect. Absolutely not. But I do think that it was a much better way to wrap up what they set up in episodes 10 and 11 than this episode 9 script, Duel of the Fates. So what I think the sequel trilogy needed more than anything else is not a different script, but it was just more time. They should have taken more time to polish the script, to look at it from various angles, to get some more people, and also some critical people. They were in such a rush to finish that. You know, every 2 years we need a Star Wars movie to make our money back. And I think that actually is the main reason that the sequel trilogy has its opponents and people that were disappointed. I think that it was fine. I loved it. But I also feel with many of you that it was also it was such a missed opportunity. It could have been so much better, even without really changing the main story. But it just needed more time to mature. Those were the questions that I wanted to answer today. I hope you enjoyed this. How long have we been on the air? Well, about an hour. So let me spend the final 5 minutes chatting with the people in the live chat room. see if there are any additional things that I need to comment upon. And if you would like to listen to an audio version of this as a podcast, I will post this as an episode of my my series Story Secrets, which is a podcast show that I record for my patrons. And if you want to support what I do and you want to help me to do more of this, then check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/Father Roderick. My patrons get extra perks, but of course, more importantly, you get to show your support for what I do. So let me go to the chat here and take a look at what people are saying. We've got Peter there. Have you seen? I have now seen Star Wars episodes 4 to 6? It blends more into each other. Star Trek, it's more separate films. Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to explain when I was answering your last week's question. R2-D2 reminds me of Groot in Guardians of the Galaxy. Can't understand that either. Yeah, that's a good point. It's a character that you don't understand, and yet you do know how he feels. Nice comparison. I think that Guardians of the Galaxy, especially the movies, do actually have a lot of kind of Star Wars style storytelling in it. And I do believe that without Star Wars, you wouldn't have the Guardians of the Galaxy that we now know and love. Mateus, the writing is incredible in this show. Tony Gilroy writes so well. Yes, especially the dialogue. And then, of course, you've got some amazing actors. I keep being blown away by every single actor. Even the minor roles are just beyond anything we've seen so far. If only we would have this quality of writing and acting for the prequels. Oh, well. we will never have that. But going forward, I have high hopes for Star Wars. Star Wars is heroic fantasy set in space. Good summary, Sandy, of what Star Wars is. Terrence says that one of the spaceships we see in episode 11 was actually based on a prototype for A New Hope. Yeah, they've been using a lot of the prototypes and the sketches and a lot of the Ralph McQuarrie artwork that was created sometimes 20, 30 years ago as a source of inspiration for new spaceships. So it all kind of feels congruent with what is already out there. And then, of course, even George Lucas commissioned a ton of artwork that was never used. And so I think there is so much quality stuff out there, even though George Lucas may not have lighted it for his movies, but it's still quality stuff. So yeah, that's pretty good. Terrence also says the music is killing it in Andor. Yeah, I would say the music for me is what I like about it is that it is how different it is, and it still works. It's not my type of music, though. I am still a bit partisan when it comes to I prefer the kind of the classic John Williams type of music. But I'm again, just as I applaud that they are trying out new genres, different style of writing. I do like that they allow totally different composers and different music styles to try their hand at Star Wars, and a lot of people do like the soundtracks for Andor. Personally, it's not music that I would listen to outside of watching the series. And whereas I do listen to a lot of Star Wars music, even if I'm not watching the series. Let's see. We've got Dino Vader who sent me a super sticker. Thank you so much. That is so kind of you. Let's see. What are you writing? Shiba Dog writing with a brush, writing number 1 on a piece of paper. What is your overall rating of the season so far, Andre wants to know. I would give Andor a 9 out of 10. Yeah, a 9 out of 10. Not a 10 out of 10, because I feel that there is more to come. What I would like is, in order to get this to a 10 out of 10, take the quality of Andor, the type of writing, the type of dialogue, acting, etc., and make movies with this quality. That will get me a 10 out of 10. Or, well, get Lucasfilm a 10 out of 10. This demands for, like, I want Star Wars to continue on this level, but to widen it, to broaden it. This is the quality that Star Wars deserves, and we haven't gotten it with the sequels, and we haven't gotten it with a couple of those television series. But the bar is set. Now I want them to go to 10 out of 10. I think that wraps it up for all the questions and comments in the chat room. So thank you very much for those of you that have been joining me live. Thank you for those of you that are listening to this on your Patreon personalized feed. Thank you for your financial support of what I do. I really appreciate it. And thanks for those of you that are watching this live recording all the way to the end on my YouTube channel. I really appreciate the time that you invested in this, even though it's not very fancy with all sorts of graphics and stuff. But I hope that at least the quality of the conversation was good enough for you. So thanks for watching. We'll talk soon. May the Force be with you.